Welcome, dear listener, to another long journey into the quieter corners of the past. You've arrived at Sleepy Historian, where we make space for the slower, gentler side of history. What some might call boring history for sleep, though here, boring is precisely the point. These stories unfold softly, like a lullaby woven from ancient times. They are not meant to excite or stir you awake, but rather to ease you into stillness, carrying you gently towards rest. If this kind of calm storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And I'd love to know who's listening. Drop a comment below with where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. There's something strangely comforting in knowing that across oceans and continents, others are also falling asleep to the same soft-spoken history documentary. So dim the lights. Let the voices of the past drift close. Imagine the river breeze, carrying faint echoes from long ago. Tonight, we'll embark on a slow, steady exploration of a subject that was once utterly ordinary, yet now holds mysteries that scholars still untangle. The boats of the Nile River. The Nile was more than a river. It was a living highway, a provider of food, a boundary between life and desert. To sail upon was to touch the very rhythm of ancient Egyptian existence. From humble reed rafts used by fishermen to elaborate ships crafted for pharaohs, every vessel told a story. Some stories were practical, some ceremonial, and some lost to the silence of sand and time. Across the next hours, we will travel through 4 gentle chapters. First, we'll immerse ourselves in the daily life of those who worked along the Nile. Fishermen, ferrymen, and traders whose humble boats carried the weight of survival. Next, we'll slow our gaze upon a singular story, a notable voyage or figure connected to these ancient crafts. In our 3rd chapter, we'll drift into archaeology, mysteries and fragments pulled from tomb walls and riverbeds, piecing together forgotten designs. And finally, we will contrast the humble worker's boat with the ornate vessels of the elite, exploring how simple wood and rope became symbols of power. This will not be hurried. Like the steady current of the Nile itself, the narration will meander, unhurried and constant. You may drift in and out of attention, and that is perfectly fine. Let your mind wander. If you find yourself asleep before we finish, the river of history will still be flowing when you return. So let's begin. Let the Nile open before you, wide and shimmering beneath a timeless sky. The oars dip gently into the water, and the boat drifts onward into a past that was never in a rush, and yet always moving. Imagine yourself standing at the river's edge in the stillness of early morning. The sun has barely risen, and the Nile glows with a soft golden haze. A fisherman pushes a small boat, no larger than a few paces in length, into the water. The hull is made of tightly bound bundles of papyrus reeds, curved upwards at the ends. With practiced ease, he steps in, steadying himself against the gentle sway, and begins to push away from the bank with a long pole. This was the most common sight along the ancient riverbanks. Day after day, countless small reed boats ferried people across channels, carried baskets of fish, and transported jars of water. Life was rhythmic, repetitive, and deeply connected to the river's moods. For many, the Nile was not just a place of work, but the very thread that stitched daily survival together. Reed boats were astonishingly simple, yet effective. A farmer could cut tall papyrus stalks, dry them under the sun, then bind them into a shape that floated lightly on the water. The design was humble, but it served. These boats were not made to last for years. Some lasted only weeks before being replaced, but they were quick to build and easy to repair. In their fragility, they mirrored the fragility of the daily lives they supported. The river was not quiet. The air carried a chorus. The splash of poles pushing against the shallow bottom, the creak of wood from larger vessels, the soft calls of boatmen hailing one another across the water. Children played near the banks, their laughter mixing with the rustling reeds. Traders moved slowly downstream, their craft piled with jars of beer, baskets of barley, or bundles of flax. Every movement was dictated by the current. One could row or pole or use a simple sail of woven cloth, but always the Nile decided the pace. Fishing was one of the most essential tasks. Men cast nets from their boats, the weighted edges sinking quickly before being hauled back with wriggling silver fish. Others used woven traps lowered into the water overnight. Fish fed the villages, filled the markets, and provided offerings for temples. The rhythm of casting, waiting, and pulling was as constant as the flowing current itself. Even simple crossings of the river carried meaning. A woman might sit on a reed boat, clutching a clay jar, her reflection mirrored in the water as she drifted to the opposite shore. A farmer might ferry a goat or sheep across, holding tight so it would not leap into the water. In such small actions, the Nile was not an abstract idea. It was a living companion. The river could also be unpredictable. Sudden winds might stir the surface into waves that threatened fragile papyrus boats. Sandbars appeared and disappeared with the shifting flow. The annual flood, both feared and welcomed, changed everything. Boats became lifelines during the high waters, connecting scattered settlements and allowing people to move between temporary islands of land. For the people of ancient Egypt, there was little separation between work, ritual, and survival. A man pushing a fishing boat into the Nile might murmur a small prayer to the river spirits. A ferryman might whisper thanks as he arrived safely on the other side. Life along the Nile was a continuous weaving of labor and reverence, with each boat carrying not only goods and people, but hopes and fears as well. And so, as the day wore on, the banks of the Nile remained alive with quiet industry. Boats moved like insects across the shining surface, small, fragile, and countless. Each one was a fragment of a much larger story, the story of a civilization that lived and breathed with the water. To see them now, even in the imagination, is to glimpse the steady pulse of ordinary existence, flowing endlessly with the river's current. As the morning grew into midday, the Nile became a wide stage of steady motion. Picture the banks lined with people tending to their boats, adjusting sails, or tightening ropes woven from flax. The river was rarely still. Its waters shimmered with constant passage. A ferryman might row back and forth a dozen times in a day, carrying passengers across from one side to the other. Traders drifted by with their small cargoes, their progress slow but unceasing. The soundscape was gentle but busy, wooden oars dipping, the muted splash of poles striking the shallows, and voices drifting over the wide water. Travel by boat was more than convenience. It was necessity. Roads were scarce and rough, especially once you left the clustered villages and towns. The Nile was the single unbroken path that connected Egypt from its southern reaches to the Mediterranean delta. In this sense, every boat, no matter how small, was part of a far larger system, an invisible web of travel and exchange that kept life moving. Some boats carried messages. A scribe might travel with rolled papyrus, sealed with a lump of clay, delivering account from one village headman to another. Others carried craftsmen with their tools, moving from town to town to repair or build. On these boats, voices mingled with the creak of wood and the rush of wind in woven sails. Every trip was at once ordinary and essential. Fishing boats, too, created a particular rhythm. A man in a reed craft leaned over the side, lowering his net with practiced hands. He knew the currents, the habits of fish, and the spots where the catch would be richest. When the net was raised, the glint of scales flashed in the sun before the haul was tipped into a basket. Families waited on shore, knowing the day's meal depended on the river's generosity. Others dried fish to preserve it, laying them in rows that caught the light like silver tiles. Even the humblest boat might carry sacred duties. Offerings were sometimes transported to shrines across the water, bundles of flowers, small jars of beer, or bread for a local temple. These gestures blurred the line between daily labor and worship. The Nile itself was seen as a gift of the gods, and to travel its waters was to move along a sacred thread woven through life and eternity. There were dangers quiet but real. A poorly bound reed boat might grow waterlogged, the papyrus swelling and sinking beneath its load. Sudden storms, though rare, could whip sails and scatter fragile vessels. Crocodiles and hippos still lived in the river during these times, creatures respected and feared. Most journeys ended safely, yet each one carried an undercurrent of risk, accepted as part of the flow of life. Still, routine triumphed over fear. Children learned to help with the family boat almost as soon as they could walk. A boy might practice pushing with a small pole in shallow water, his laughter mixing with the rush of the current. Girls carried baskets of reeds or fish, balancing them carefully as they stepped on and off the bobbing craft. These skills were passed on quietly, generation to generation, with no great ceremony, just the repetition of daily necessity. By the evening, as the heat softened and the sun began its descent, the Nile shifted once more. Boats returned toward the banks, nets emptied, and cargoes delivered. The waters reflected the glow of the sky, turning copper and rose. Families gathered near the shore, pulling their boats onto dry sand or anchoring them with wooden stakes. The river that had carried them through the day now carried their reflections into night. This was the ordinary world of ancient Egypt. Not the grandeur of temples or the glory of kings, but the calm persistence of small boats, countless journeys, and the endless pulse of the river. The Nile was a highway, a workplace, and a sacred gift, and in its gentle rhythm, whole generations lived and passed, each leaving only ripples in the flow of time. As the day waned, the Nile softened into calm. The blazing sun that had glared upon the water mellowed into amber light, and the boats along the river slowed their pace. Imagine the long reflections stretching across the water, the quiet silhouettes of reed bundles and small sails against the horizon. Evening was the gentlest time on the Nile, when the labor of the day gave way to preparation for the night. Fishermen, their nets emptied of the day's catch, sat in their swaying reed crafts, mending frayed cords with nimble hands. The faint scent of drying fish drifted over the banks, mingling with the smell of damp reeds and cool river air. On the shore, women waited with baskets, lifting fish carefully, arranging them in rows to be salted or laid in the sun for tomorrow's trade. Small fires glimmered here and there, their smoke curling lazily, signaling meals being prepared for families who had spent long hours on the water. The boats themselves bore the marks of use and time. Some were darkened from many days under the sun. Others sagged at the edges, their papyrus bundles swelling with moisture. Few lasted long, yet their impermanence was accepted, much like the fragility of life itself. Boats were remade, reed by reed, just as lives were renewed, day after day, in the endless rhythm of survival. Even travel across the river took on a different quality at dusk. The water grew cooler, smoother, as breezes softened and the current slowed. Ferrymen stood with poles braced against the riverbed, their shadows elongated on the surface. Passengers sat quietly, their thoughts turned inward as the day's voices hushed. Some carried baskets of grain for tomorrow's baking. Others held children close, rocking them in rhythm with the river's gentle sway. It was in such hours that the river seemed to invite reflection. To sit in a small craft, drifting in the hush of twilight, was to feel time stretch out endlessly. The Nile was more than a waterway. It was a mirror of existence, steady and unyielding. It flowed long before the boatman was born and would flow long after he was gone. His hands may grow weary, his boats may sink and be rebuilt, but the current remained, eternal and indifferent. Animals, too, marked their presence along the evening river. Birds skimmed low across the surface, their wings stirring soft ripples. Frogs sang from the reeds in steady, rhythmic patterns, creating a natural chorus that blended with the creak of rope and wood. In the fading light, crocodiles sometimes surfaced far downstream, their quiet movements noticed yet not spoken of, as if acknowledging them aloud might invite misfortune. The Nile was shared by all, human and creature alike. Children played by the water's edge until their parents called them back. They splashed their feet, floated small toy boats made from leftover papyrus, and laughed at the tiny crafts bobbing clumsily in the shallows. These simple games echoed the lives they would grow into. For one day, they too would pole across the river, cast nets, or guide animals on fragile boats. Childhood on the Nile was not separate from work. It was the quiet rehearsal for the tasks of adulthood. As darkness drew near, the stars appeared above the river, mirrored in its slow-moving surface. Families gathered their boats close to the shore, securing them with stakes driven deep into the sand. Some sang softly as they worked, simple songs passed down like heirlooms, their rhythms matching the gentle lapping of the water. The night along the Nile was not silent, but hushed, filled with the subdued sounds of a civilization settling into rest. And then, as the fires burned low and voices faded, the boats rested in stillness. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Reeds cut, nets cast, goods ferried, prayers murmured. Day by day, generation by generation, this was the essence of life along the Nile. Not the dramatic events that filled royal inscriptions, but the humble routines, the quiet persistence, the endless weaving of lives around the river's current. In this way, the Nile carried not only boats, but time itself. Its flow was the pulse of daily existence, unhurried, constant, and deeply ordinary. To imagine it now is to imagine a life measured not in monuments or battles, but in repeated crossings, repaired nets, and fading sunlight on the water. It was history not written on stone, but lived in small boats and carried away, like ripples, into the eternal stream. In the world of ancient Egypt, the Nile was not only a lifeline for common villagers. It was also a stage upon which rulers displayed their power and connection to the divine. Among the many stories preserved on temple walls and in fragments of inscriptions, there is one recurring image: the pharaoh traveling by boat. This was not a mere convenience of transport. It was a carefully crafted performance, a journey that intertwined politics, ritual, and symbolism in a way that only the Nile could support. Imagine, then, the preparations for such a voyage. The air was filled with expectation. Artisans worked for days to prepare a royal boat built not of fragile reeds, but of sturdy timbers brought from distant lands. Cedar wood from Lebanon was prized above all. Its scent rich and its grain strong, able to support great decks and elaborate carvings. Teams of carpenters fitted planks together with mortise and tenon joints, bound tightly with rope and sealed with resin. The hull curved like a crescent moon, its surface painted in vivid colors. On the appointed day, the boat was brought to the riverbank. Attendants bustled, priests murmured prayers, and oarsmen stood ready. The pharaoh approached with ceremony, clothed in fine linen, his presence both human and divine. When he stepped aboard, the boat itself seemed transformed into a sacred stage, a floating temple. The prow might bear the head of a falcon or the lotus blossom of Upper Egypt, symbols meant to remind all who watched that this was no ordinary craft. The journey began with slow, steady strokes of the oars. The Nile accepted the weight of the royal bark, carrying it smoothly along its current. Drums beat in soft rhythm, marking the cadence for the rowers. Priests lifted incense burners, and the sweet smoke curled upward, mingling with the scent of the river. The people gathered on the banks to watch, kneeling or raising their hands in greeting. For them, to see the pharaoh pass by boat was to witness the divine moving upon the earth. Such journeys had many purposes. Sometimes the pharaoh traveled to inspect temple construction or oversee harvest collection. At other times, he journeyed for religious festivals, where his presence by boat symbolized unity between the gods, the river, and the land. One of the most famous ceremonies was the beautiful Festival of the Valley, when statues of gods were carried across the Nile to visit shrines on the opposite bank. In such moments, royal boats did not simply transport. They enacted myth, embodying the eternal cycle of renewal. These journeys were not without danger. A storm could rise suddenly, threatening the stability of even the grandest vessel. Accounts mention offerings cast into the river, prayers whispered urgently to Happy, the spirit of the Nile, to ensure safe passage. Yet the risks only magnified the drama of the voyage. Each safe return reinforced the image of the pharaoh as chosen and protected, one whose authority flowed as surely as the river itself. Even in death, the imagery of royal boats persisted. Tomb walls show scenes of pharaohs journeying across the Nile, not just in life, but toward the afterlife. The solar bark of the sun god Ra, sailing across the sky by day and through the underworld by night, was mirrored in the funerary rituals of kings. To travel by boat was to travel in harmony with cosmic order. Thus, when we picture a royal voyage along the Nile, we glimpse more than spectacle. We see a moment where wood, rope, water, and ceremony wove together into something enduring. The ordinary act of sailing became elevated, transformed into a message that echoed across centuries. The pharaoh rules, the gods approve, and the river carries both man and divine presence forward. This, then, was the other face of Nile boats, no longer fragile papyrus rafts for fishermen, but mighty cedar vessels adorned with color and song. In their slow passage across the shimmering water, they carried not just a ruler, but the hopes, fears, and devotion of an entire people. Among the most remarkable boat journeys recorded in ancient Egyptian history was the expedition to Punt, launched during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut. Her temple at Deir el-Bahri preserves vivid reliefs of this journey, carved with careful detail and accompanied by inscriptions that tell us not only of the goods brought back, but of the vision behind such a voyage. To imagine this expedition is to glimpse both the ambition of a ruler and the practical brilliance of boat builders who dared to cross waters beyond the familiar Nile. The land of Punt was described as a place of abundance. Trees heavy with incense, exotic animals, and goods unseen in Egypt promised wealth and prestige. Yet Punt was far to the south, beyond deserts and coasts, accessible only by a long sea journey that began on the Nile itself. To undertake this mission, Hatshepsut ordered the construction of large ships, different from the reed and small wooden boats of daily life. These were seagoing vessels, their hulls strengthened for open waters, their planks tied together with rope and pegged for sturdiness. The reliefs show long ships with tall prows, broad decks, and sails billowing in imagined winds. Each was crewed by dozens of rowers, men working in unison, their oars rising and falling like wings. The ships were stocked with food, water jars, and offerings, for the journey was as much diplomatic as commercial. Priests were on board, tasked with performing rituals to safeguard the expedition. Soldiers also traveled, not for conquest, but for protection against the unknown. From the Nile, these vessels would have been dismantled and transported across land to the shores of the Red Sea, where they were reassembled. Imagine the labor, hundreds of workers hauling timbers, ropes, and sails across desert terrain, guided by the will of their queen. At the shore, the vessels were rebuilt, fitted once more with care, and prepared to face waters very different from the calm current of the Nile. The voyage itself was daring. Unlike the predictable rhythm of the river, the Red Sea offered tides, waves, and winds that tested the limits of Egyptian seamanship. Yet the reliefs assure us of success. The Egyptians reached Punt and returned with treasures that seemed almost magical. Fragrant myrrh trees transplanted to Egyptian soil, ivory, ebony, gold, and exotic animals including monkeys and leopards. Most striking of all was the portrayal of the people of Punt, shown welcoming the Egyptians with gestures of friendship, their dwellings built on stilts above the ground. When the expedition returned to Thebes, it was more than an economic triumph. It was a statement of Hatshepsut's power and vision. She was not merely caretaker of the throne. She was a ruler capable of extending Egypt's reach across distant seas. The incense trees planted in temple courtyards became living symbols of this achievement, roots of a foreign land now nourishing Egyptian soil. For the people who watched the ships glide once more upon the Nile, heavy with cargo, The moment must have seemed extraordinary. Ordinary reed boats carried food and fish. Royal barks carried kings. But these vessels had traveled to lands beyond sight, returning with marvels. They were floating proof that Egypt's power and imagination extended far beyond the horizon. The reliefs endure, carved in stone, but the ships themselves are gone, dismantled, repurposed, or left to decay. What remains is the quiet echo of a daring journey, one in which boats became bridges not only across water, but across cultures and worlds. Hatshepsut's voyage to Punt reminds us that even in an age defined by the Nile's gentle current, Egyptians dreamed of distant shores and sailed toward them. In life, pharaohs used boats to demonstrate their power, to travel for ritual, and to extend their influence. In death, the symbolism of boats only deepened. The Nile had long been a pathway not only across the land, but between worlds. Just as a fisherman crossed from one bank to another, the soul of a king was imagined to cross from life into eternity. Boats became vessels of transformation. They were not only tools for survival, but carriers of the divine journey after death. Perhaps the most striking evidence of this belief lies at Giza, near the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Buried beside the pyramid, sealed in long stone pits, archaeologists discovered great wooden ships, often called solar boats. These vessels had lain in darkness for over 4,000 years, preserved in fragments, their timbers carefully disassembled and stacked like a puzzle awaiting reconstruction. In 1954, one of these boats was painstakingly rebuilt, revealing a craft over 40 meters in length, a masterpiece of ancient shipbuilding. Imagine standing before it, a boat large enough to carry dozens of men, yet built without metal nails. Instead, planks of cedar were joined with rope, lashed together in a way both flexible and strong. Its prow curved high, elegant and commanding, while its sides bore the marks of ancient tools. Though never meant to sail upon earthly waters, the boat seemed ready to glide. It was a vessel prepared not for the Nile, but for the celestial river, carrying the soul of Khufu alongside the sun god Ra. The symbolism was powerful. Each day, the sun was imagined to rise in a boat, traveling across the sky, before descending into the underworld at night. By including a boat in his burial, Khufu aligned himself with this eternal cycle. Death was not an end, but a voyage. Just as ordinary Egyptians ferried across the Nile daily, the pharaoh too would cross. Only his journey was cosmic, joining the rhythm of sun and stars. Khufu was not alone in this practice. Other pyramids and royal tombs also contained boat pits, some filled with full vessels, others represented in carvings or models. Even in more modest graves, small wooden boat figurines were placed among the offerings. These miniatures, sometimes painted with tiny rowers, reflected the same belief, that the afterlife required passage, and that boats were the chosen means to make it. The discovery of Khufu's solar boat offers more than symbolism. It also shows us the height of Egyptian craftsmanship. The cedar wood came from distant Lebanon, shipped down to Egypt, cut, shaped, and assembled with remarkable skill. The scale of the boat demonstrates both resources and devotion, for such a construction was not simply practical. It was sacred labor, an offering to eternity. Standing today in a museum built to house it, the boat feels strangely alive, as though waiting for the river it was promised. Its ropes, now silent, once flexed and tightened under the pull of water. Its timbers, carefully smoothed, once carried the scent of cedar across the desert air. Yet it never touched the Nile again. Its river was the sky. Thus, the story of Nile boats extends beyond daily life and royal ceremony into the realm of eternity. For the pharaoh, to die was to embark, to board a boat prepared not for trade or fishing, but for passage among the gods. These vessels remind us that boats were not only physical tools, but spiritual bridges, linking the temporal with the eternal, the shore of life with the far horizon of death. For much of history, the boats of the Nile were ephemeral things. Papyrus reeds decayed quickly, wood rotted in the dampness, and what was left behind often vanished into the earth. Generations lived and died along the river, leaving little trace of the countless vessels that had carried them. For archaeologists, this posed a challenge. How does one reconstruct the story of Nile boats when the boats themselves are gone? The answer came slowly, through fragments, burial pits, and painted walls that whispered of what once was. When explorers first dug near the pyramids at Giza, they were astonished to find long stone-lined pits beside the tombs. Some were empty, shaped like vessels carved in the ground, their outlines echoing the hulls of boats that had either decayed or been removed. Others contained real boats, carefully dismantled, their planks stacked like an enormous wooden puzzle sealed away for millennia. These discoveries revealed that the Egyptians had buried boats deliberately, offering them to eternity just as they offered food, clothing, and treasures. The greatest of these finds was Khufu's solar boat, reconstructed piece by piece from over 1,000 timbers. It was not the only one. In 2021, archaeologists uncovered another intact royal boat pit at Giza, its timbers remarkably preserved beneath layers of sand. Each new find added to the sense of mystery. Were these boats meant to be used in the afterlife? Or were they symbolic reflections of the pharaoh's journeys in life? Beyond the great tombs, archaeologists also found traces of more ordinary boats. At workers' villages near pyramid sites, pieces of rope or fragments and small models turned up in the soil. These humble remains spoke of ferries, fishing craft, and transport boats that served not kings but laborers, carrying supplies and stone across canals dug from the Nile. The fragments were modest, yet they filled in the picture of daily life that had otherwise dissolved into the river's silence. Painted tomb walls gave further clues. Scenes showed fishermen casting nets from reed rafts, traders guiding barges loaded with goods, and families poling across calm waters. These images were more than decoration. They were records, frozen in pigment, of boats that no longer floated. Though stylized, the paintings revealed designs, proportions, and practices that archaeology alone could not recover. Still, mysteries remained. Wooden fragments sometimes puzzled researchers, their shapes unfamiliar, their purposes unclear. Were they part of ceremonial boats, river barges, or seagoing vessels? The absence of metal nails and the reliance on rope lashings seemed improbable to modern eyes, yet the strength of such constructions was proven again and again. Some scholars suggested that boats might have even been used in transporting enormous stone blocks for pyramid construction, floated on barges along canals to the building sites. The idea is debated, yet it illustrates how deeply boats were entwined with Egypt's greatest achievements. The preservation of boats was uneven. The Nile's damp soil devoured organic remains quickly, but the desert offered protection where conditions were dry. Thus, some of the best preserved finds came not from the riverbanks themselves, but from tombs and desert edges. Each discovery was like a faint echo of a once loud chorus, offering just enough to imagine the rest. To walk through a museum where one of these ancient vessels is displayed is to feel the weight of that mystery. The cedar timbers, polished by time, seem impossibly ancient yet strangely modern in their precision. The scale overwhelms. How could something so large, built without iron tools or nails, endure through centuries of silence? Each boat reconstructed in the modern era is not only an artifact, but a question mark, pointing toward lives and practices we can glimpse but never fully recover. Thus, archaeology gives us fragments, whispers, shadows on stone, and rare, miraculous survivors. From them, we weave back the story of Nile boats, piecing together not just how they were built, but how they carried a civilization across both water and time. The mysteries they leave behind, why certain boats were buried, how exactly they were used, and what symbolic meanings they carried, remain open, inviting us to imagine the countless journeys lost to the river's flow. When we think of a boat, it is easy to imagine it simply as a vessel, something that carries people or goods across water. Yet in ancient Egypt, boats carried far more than passengers or stone. They bore meaning. To step into a boat was not only to move across the Nile. It was also to step into a deeper current of ritual and symbolism that touched every layer of Egyptian life. The Nile itself was sacred, Its rising and falling dictated the rhythm of harvest, the fertility of fields, and the stability of kingdoms. It was often imagined as a divine force, a lifeline threading between the realms of the living and the eternal. In such a landscape, boats became not just tools, but mediators between worlds. They linked the fertile valley to the desert beyond, the villages to the temples, and life to death. Reliefs and inscriptions show that boats played roles in festivals. During great processions, priests carried statues of gods in ceremonial barges, either set afloat upon the river or carried upon shoulders in imitation of a vessel's form. These ritual boats glowed with decoration, carved prows, painted sides, and bright cloths fluttering in the breeze. For onlookers, they were not mere objects, but symbols of divine presence traveling among the people. The solar bark, the mythic boat that carried the sun god Ra across the sky each day, was central to Egyptian cosmology. As the sun rose, Ra's boat sailed from the eastern horizon, bringing light to the world. At dusk, it descended into the underworld, facing dangers and enemies, yet always re-emerging at dawn. To the Egyptians, this was more than a myth. It was a pattern of existence itself, the cycle of day and night, of life and death, endlessly renewed. Pharaohs often aligned themselves with this journey, their own funerary boats echoing the solar bark, preparing them to sail with Ra into eternity. Even humble funerary models, small wooden or clay boats buried with ordinary people, carried echoes of this belief. Archaeologists have found such models tucked into graves, their miniature oarsmen frozen mid-stroke. These were not toys, but vessels for the soul, assurances that the departed could travel freely in the afterlife, navigating both the Nile and the spiritual waters beyond. The act of burial itself often took place by boat. When a person died, their body might be ferried across the Nile to the necropolis. The crossing held layers of meaning, a passage from east to west, from the realm of the living sun to the silent land of the dead. Each small funeral ferry echoed the larger cosmic journey, a reminder that the Nile was more than geography. It was a bridge between worlds. Yet the symbolism did not erase the practical. Ritual boats still had to be built, maintained, and rowed. Carpenters shaped timbers with skill. Boatmen guided ceremonial craft with practiced hands. This intersection of the ordinary and the sacred gives Egyptian boat culture its richness. A fisherman's raft and a god's barge shared the same water, yet one fed a family and the other embodied cosmic renewal. Both, however, belong to the same continuum of meaning. The mysteries arise when we attempt to distinguish where practicality ended and ritual began. Was every funerary boat actually used in transport, or were some crafted solely for burial? Were the magnificent royal boats ever launched upon the Nile, or were they destined only for eternal rest beneath the sand? These questions remain open, and perhaps they were never meant to be answered in clear divisions. To the Egyptians, life and death, practical and sacred, often blended seamlessly. For modern observers, this blending can be difficult to grasp. We are accustomed to separating the functional from the symbolic, the tool from the ritual. Yet to ancient Egyptians, a boat was always more than wood and rope. It was a sign, a vessel, a promise, a bridge. The survival of such symbols in art and archaeology allows us to glimpse how deeply their worldview was shaped by the water they lived beside. Thus, as we examine the remains of planks, models, and painted barges, we are not only reconstructing technology, we are also touching a quiet mystery. How an entire civilization found in the simple act of floating upon a river the reflection of the cosmos itself. The fragments of Nile boats that reach us today are tantalizing but incomplete. To bridge the gaps, modern scholars and craftsmen have turned to reconstruction. By piecing together ancient timbers, copying tomb paintings, and experimenting with ancient techniques, they attempt to sail once more upon the river of history. One of the most famous projects unfolded in the mid-20th century, when Khufu's solar boat was carefully reassembled. The process took years, for the 1,000-plus wooden pieces had been buried dismantled, sealed in a pit for over 4 millennia. Each plank was like part of an enormous riddle. The builders of the modern age had to learn from the builders of the ancient one, discovering how mortises and lashings replaced nails, how timbers curved into a hull with nothing but precision and rope. When the boat finally stood complete, it stretched over 40 meters long, a vessel of both beauty and mystery. Its original voyage is uncertain, but its symbolic weight immense. Other experimental archaeology projects have gone further, building replicas of smaller reed or wooden boats to test their seaworthiness. Some scholars wondered whether the Egyptians ventured beyond the Nile to the Red Sea or even across to Lebanon, where cedar was harvested. Modern reconstructions have shown that, even without metal nails, such boats could withstand surprising distances. Their flexibility is strength rather than a weakness. The experiments do not give us certainty, but they offer possibility. Perhaps the Egyptians' nautical world was larger than we first imagined. Despite these reconstructions, puzzles remain. Archaeological finds suggest boat designs that do not always match the tomb paintings. Were artists simplifying forms for symbolic clarity, or were they depicting real types that we have yet to discover? Models buried in tombs sometimes show details absent in other records. Unusual or arrangements, curved prows, or miniature cabins. Each artifact expands the range of what Nile boats might have been, but also complicates the picture, as if the river is reluctant to reveal all its secrets. Even the question of purpose lingers. A boat buried beside a king's pyramid. Was it truly launched upon the Nile during life, carrying the pharaoh in ceremonies? Or was it built solely for death, intended never to touch water, but only to accompany the soul? The absence of direct records leaves us in a space of speculation. Scholars debate, but in truth, the silence of the ancient builders is part of the mystery's endurance. Museums that display these boats often emphasize their majesty, their size, and their antiquity. Yet standing before one, the impression is subtler. The cedar timbers carry a faint scent, even now, reminding us that this was once living wood, shaped by hands thousands of years ago. The curves are elegant, but they suggest not a relic, but a craft ready to move. One can almost imagine the oars dipping, the ropes creaking, the water parting gently before the prow. The past seems near, but never quite within reach. This distance is precisely what gives Nile boats their unique fascination. Unlike monuments of stone, which stand solid and enduring, the boats belong to water and time. They were transient by nature, meant to float, to move, to vanish. The few that survive do so almost by accident, save by dry sand or sealed pits. Their survival is fragile, a reminder that most have been lost forever. That sense of loss, of incompleteness, deepens the calm melancholy that surrounds them. And yet, perhaps it is fitting. The Nile itself is a river that flows on, never still, always carrying away and renewing. The boats that once drifted on its waters shared that rhythm. They came, they served, they vanished. What we hold now are echoes, fragments, reconstructions, enough to glimpse but not enough to fully possess. In the end, the mystery of Nile boats may never be solved completely. But that mystery has a quiet value. It reminds us that history is not always about certainty, but about listening to faint voices, following clues, and accepting what slips away. As you imagine these vessels, half seen, half forgotten, picture them drifting slowly into the distance, their outlines fading in the mist above the river. They are there, yet unreachable, forever part of a story that flows gently on. Not all boats upon the Nile were equal. Just as in every society, wealth and power revealed themselves not only in temples and tombs, but also in the vessels that moved along the water. Where the fishermen relied on papyrus rafts bound together with rope, and the trader worked a barge patched and worn by use. The pharaoh or noble floated upon the river in a craft that proclaimed status, privilege, and authority. Boats became not only tools of movement, but visible symbols of hierarchy. Accounts from tomb paintings, reliefs, and rare written records suggest that the elite traveled in large wooden boats, often crafted from imported cedar or acacia. These ships were spacious, with high decks, shaded cabins, and ornate decorations. Their hulls gleamed with polished wood, while brightly painted prows curved upward like the necks of swans. To see such a vessel upon the Nile must have been striking, a moving emblem of power gliding over the water. For nobles and officials, boats were extensions of estate life. They were used for leisure as well as duty. Scenes preserved in artwork show noblemen seated beneath canopies while servants rowed or pulled the vessel forward. Sometimes the boat was filled with musicians, attendants, and even hunting parties. In the marshes, elite men and women used boats to hunt birds or spear fish, turning what was necessity for peasants into pastime. The differences were clear. What for one person was survival, for another was recreation framed by abundance. Pharaohs, however, commanded vessels beyond comparison. Royal barges were immense, crafted with the finest imported timbers and manned by dozens of oarsmen. These boats served ceremonial functions, transporting the king during festivals, parades, or inspection tours of the Nile. The pharaoh's presence on the water mirrored his cosmic role, master of the land's lifeline, visible to his people as a figure both human and divine. Ritual journeys often involved processional boats carrying sacred statues. During great festivals, the god's image was placed aboard a gilded barge, rowed or towed by teams of priests and boatmen, with crowds lining the riverbanks. In these moments, the sacred and the royal intertwined, for the pharaoh's barge often accompanied the divine, underscoring his role as intermediary between gods and people. The construction of such elite vessels required resources far beyond the reach of common people. Egypt imported cedar from Lebanon, pine from Syria, and other valuable woods to build ships of grandeur. This trade itself demonstrated the pharaoh's power, as foreign resources were gathered to serve Egyptian prestige. Rope, linen sails, and skilled labor were organized on a massive scale, overseen by officials whose entire role was to ensure the smooth running of royal fleets. And yet, these vessels, however magnificent, still floated upon the same Nile as the smallest raft. The river carried both king and fisherman, but the contrast between their experiences was profound. Where one labored against the current to bring home food, the other reclined upon cushions while the boat became a stage for authority. The contrast speaks quietly but clearly of inequality woven into the very fabric of Egyptian society. This duality is visible in tomb art. On one wall, we might see laborers struggling with nets or ferrying goods, their bodies bent and straining. On another, only a few feet away, a noble reclines while his attendants steer him smoothly across calm water. The boats differ, the gestures differ, the meanings differ, but both scenes are painted within the same tomb, as if acknowledging that Egypt's river life was shared yet deeply divided. These distinctions remind us that boats were not neutral tools. They were mirrors of social order. They revealed who held wealth, who commanded resources, and who lived in ease. They also revealed who labored unseen, their hands guiding the oars that moved kings across the water. In this way, the Nile itself became a stage upon which Egypt's hierarchy was performed daily, silently, and visibly. As we drift deeper into this exploration, imagine the quiet scene. A fisherman's reed, raft bobbing low, rough-hewn, patched with effort, alongside a gleaming cedar barge of the elite. Both vessels catch the same wind, hear the same cry of herons above, and feel the same sun upon their decks. Yet their worlds could not be further apart. The Nile was not only a river of work and transport, it was also a stage, a place where power and belief were performed for all to see. Across the long centuries of Egyptian civilization, boats became central to festivals, processions, and grand displays that reinforced the structure of society. These ceremonies were not hurried events, but slow, deliberate journeys, rituals unfolding at the pace of oars and current. Among the most famous were the great religious festivals, when sacred images of the gods were placed aboard ceremonial barges. These vessels gleamed with gold, painted wood, and linen awnings. Carved prows might take the form of falcons, lotus flowers, or protective deities. As priests carried the god's statue onto the boat, the crowd gathered in hushed reverence. Then, with oars dipping into the water in rhythmic unison, the sacred barge began to glide across the Nile. From the riverbank, villagers, farmers, and craftsmen looked on, drawn into the orbit of power and divinity. For many, this may have been the only time they glimpsed such elaborate vessels. The slow passage of the barge was not simply transport, but theater, a living reminder of the god's presence and the pharaoh's authority. The people's daily boats might scrape along the river's surface unnoticed, but the ceremonial barge shimmered as a vision of order and eternity. These festivals also blended the sacred with the political. When the king appeared on the Nile in his royal barge, the symbolism was unmistakable. The ruler as master of the river, the lifeline of Egypt. Just as the Nile gave fertility and sustenance, the pharaoh provided stability and order. His presence on the water was a visual statement of his role in maintaining balance, both cosmic and earthly. Some festivals involved journeys of considerable length. Barges were towed upriver or downriver, their movements coordinated by fleets of smaller support boats. Drums and chants kept the rhythm of the oars, while incense, smoke drifted over the water. These details are preserved in temple reliefs, which show long processions of boats, their sails full, their prows aligned in solemn order. Though the scenes are carved in stone, one can almost imagine the music and murmurs that once accompanied them. Even outside great festivals, nobles often turned their boats into platforms of display. A leisurely excursion might involve musicians, dancers, or hunting in the marshes. These outings were depicted in art not only for their charm, but for what they revealed: a life of abundance, where the river was a setting for pleasure rather than survival. A nobleman seated comfortably under a canopy, a lady holding lotus flowers while attendants rowed. Such images projected wealth and refinement to eternity. The contrast with ordinary people's experiences could not have been greater. For the fisherman or ferryman, the Nile was labor, sweat on the brow, rope chafing the hands, and uncertainty about the next catch or fare. For the elite, it was a stage for leisure, faith, and prestige. This contrast was not hidden, but celebrated, carved into tomb walls, reinforcing the order of society where each person had their place. Boats also marked life's passages. Weddings, funerals, and visits to temples often involved river crossings. For the elite, these crossings were grand affairs, with decorated boats carrying entire households across the water. Even in death, the distinction remained. The pharaoh's funeral procession included great ceremonial barges, carrying not only the body but treasures, attendants, and offerings. For a commoner, the ferry across to the necropolis was humble and unadorned, yet both journeys carried symbolic weight. The spectacle of Nile ceremonies did not end with sight alone. Imagine the sounds: the creak of long oars, the splash of water against the hull, the hum of chants rising and falling with the rowing rhythm. The scent of incense mingled with the fresh water breeze. The colors, bright cloths, gold leaf, polished wood, shimmered against the river's calm surface. Each festival was a sensory event, weaving memory and meaning into the flow of daily life. For the Egyptians, these ceremonies did more than honor gods or display wealth. They reinforced a worldview in which order, hierarchy, and divine presence were visible, tangible, and undeniable. The boat was the perfect vessel for such meaning. It moved slowly, deliberately, visible to all along the banks. It symbolized not speed but stability, not chaos but harmony. In its passage, it reflected the very rhythm of the Nile itself, eternal and unhurried. Thus, the Nile festivals remind us that boats were more than transport. They were floating stages upon which the drama of civilization unfolded. To watch them glide across the river was to witness a civilization speaking to itself, reaffirming what it valued, who it served, and how it saw its place in the cosmos. When we imagine the Nile in antiquity, it is tempting to see its waters filled with identical boats, all gliding peacefully from one shore to the other. Yet the reality was layered and divided, a reflection of the unequal society that depended upon the river. The Nile was common to all, but the experiences of those who floated upon it could not have been more different. For the ordinary worker, the boat was a fragile and temporary possession. A fisherman might own nothing more than a bundle of papyrus reeds bound into a raft, patched again and again until the fibers grew soft with wear. The raft would ride low in the water, every movement sending ripples across its flexible frame. Each outing held uncertainty. Would the catch be enough? Would the craft hold together? Would the river grant safe passage? The boat was survival, as necessary as a plow or a pot, yet always precarious. For ferrymen, the Nile was a workplace rather than a home. Their boats were plain wooden craft, small barges that carried people and goods from bank to bank. The pay was modest, the work unending, and the vessel itself often scarred with repairs. Each crossing was routine, yet each was also essential. Without these ferries, the villages and fields of Egypt would have been isolated, cut off by the river that both nourished and divided. Now imagine, not far away, the sight of a noble's boat drifting past. Larger, higher, built of imported cedar, and shaded by linen awnings, it carried music and laughter rather than labor. Servants rowed, attendants fanned the air, and the noble reclined, gazing across the marshes. What for one person was struggle, for another was leisure, and the river reflected both with equal calm. At the summit of this hierarchy floated the pharaoh's barge. To see such a vessel must have been awe-inspiring. Dozens of oars dipped in unison, the prow carved into shapes of divine power, sails of fine linen catching the wind. The king appeared not only as ruler, but as living symbol of order itself, traveling on the same water that bore the fisherman's fragile raft. The message was unmistakable. Just as the Nile united Egypt, so too did the pharaoh stand above all, his vessel embodying the might of the state. Tomb paintings sometimes captured these contrasts within a single composition. In one register, peasants are shown poling small craft, bent with exertion. Above them, nobles glide in spacious boats, accompanied by music or hunting scenes. The juxtaposition is striking, as though the artists themselves wished to record both realities, the humble and the exalted, the labor and the leisure. These images remind us that the river was not only a natural boundary, but a social one. The same water carried lives that rarely intersected, except in fleeting glimpses. Perhaps a fisherman paused to watch the gilded prow of a royal barge slide by, its oars cutting the water with perfect rhythm. Perhaps a noble's attendants glanced at the ferry laden with peasants, its deck crowded and noisy. The Nile reflected all classes, yet in its broad flow it never erased the divisions between them. Still, there's also a strange unity in this diversity. Whether humble or grand, all boats depended on the river's rise and fall, on the steady skill of boatmen, on the same currents and breezes. The reed raft and the royal barge alike floated upon the same waters, subject to the same sun and wind. The contrast was sharp, but beneath it lay a shared dependence on the river's generosity. From this perspective, Nile boats become symbols of both separation and connection. They mark the distances between lives, yet they also bind those lives to a single source. The fisherman, the ferryman, the noble, and the pharaoh all needed the river, though each experienced it differently. The water united Egypt physically, but socially it revealed distinctions that would endure for millennia. As we close this chapter of contrasts, imagine the scene at dusk. The river wide and golden, reeds whispering in the breeze. A small raft drifts near the bank, its fishermen weary from the day's work. Out in the center of the river, a noble's boat glides slowly, musicians playing faintly. Further down, sails of a royal barge catch the last light of the setting sun. 3 vessels, 3 lives, 1 river, layered together in silence, yet worlds apart. And so, As our journey along the Nile draws to its gentle close, you might feel the same slow rhythm that guided the lives of ancient Egypt. The river carried fishermen in their fragile reed rafts, ferrymen balancing the needs of villages, nobles reclining in shaded comfort, and pharaohs sailing upon vessels of power and ceremony. All these stories, ordinary and extraordinary, floated upon the same waters, shaped by the same current, and touched by the same timeless flow. Tonight, you have followed those currents. You have glimpsed the daily rhythm of boatmen, the careful craft of shipbuilders, the mysteries of buried vessels, and the striking contrasts of class and privilege reflected in boats of every size. Together, these pieces form a mosaic of Nile life, a reminder that history is not only battles and kings, but also ordinary gestures, repeated across centuries, that tethered people to the land and the river that sustained them. As you listen now, perhaps you notice the calm repetition of the river's lesson. The waters rose and fell, year after year, season after season, unchanging in their constancy. Empires rose beside it, dynasties fell, yet the Nile continued, offering passage, nourishment, and silence. Its steady course mirrors the rhythm of your own breath, the rise, the fall, the slow returning cycle. Just as the Egyptians found comfort and survival in that eternal flow, so too may you find peace in the steady rhythm that carries you gently toward rest. We often forget how deeply history connects us to the natural world. The same moon that glimmered on the Nile's surface 3,000 years ago still glows tonight, quietly lighting your room, tracing silver patterns across water and window alike. The same stars that watched over the voyages of pharaohs now shine over you, constant and indifferent, yet reassuring in their permanence. Time may divide us, but in the stillness of night, the distance seems smaller, as though you two were drifting slowly down that ancient river. If this kind of soft storytelling brings you calm, I invite you to linger with the channel again. Here, with the Sleepy Historian, we create spaces for boring history to become your quiet companion, guiding you towards sleep. If these stories help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And in the comments, share where you're listening from and what time it is. There is something strangely comforting in knowing that across the world, others are also drifting to sleep, carried by the same gentle tales of the past. For now, though, there is nothing more you need to do. Let the Nile recede into stillness. Let the boats drift into memory, and allow yourself to float quietly into rest. The past will wait. The river will always flow. And you, like the fisherman, the noble, and the pharaoh, can surrender to its eternal calm and sleep.